Hey guys, what's up? Today I'll be doing a video talking about one of my favorite bands of all time, and that band is Opeth. And in this video I'll be focusing on their first three albums that came out under the label Candelight Records. And this era of the band, stretching from 1995 to 1998, has become known as their Candlelight years. And while I do like everything that Opeth released after that, including their later sound where they transitioned to more of a progressive rock and commercial sound, while I do enjoy those albums and records, the only ones that I can say I truly love, and really the only albums I care to revisit on a regular basis, is the albums that make up the Candlelight years. And it's some of the greatest music that I think has ever been released and to come out of Sweden. So I'm definitely excited to talk about and review these three albums. And the first up in the trilogy of the Candlelight years, this album came out in 1995 and is my personal favorite album of all time, and that would be Orchid. Now, the lineup on this album is Michael Ackerfeld on guitar and vocals, Peter Lindgren on guitar, Anders Norton on drums, percussion, and piano, and Johan de Farfalla on bass. And this is one of the most magical and beautiful sounding albums of all time. Of course, the Swedish sound is very much known for its majestic and beautiful melodies, and I think Opeth is the greatest example of that. The Candlelight years of Opeth, why I love them so much more than anything else they went to go on and do after, is they were able to capture such an atmosphere, and they have this duality of both sadness and also just this sweeping sense of serenity and peace. And those two elements of atmosphere coming together create really breathtaking music. The highlight of this album is the guitar work. There are so many different kinds of harmonies and counter melodies going on here. I've never heard any music or harmonies being written the same way that Opeth does on this album. Most of the time in metal and all other forms of rock music, the guitars are usually playing unanimously, and if there is a harmony, oftentimes it's usually just the same riff but maybe transposed up a fifth, down a third, or some kind of interval. That is not the case with Opeth on this album. Each guitar part has a completely distinct and separate riff or pattern that come together to create one whole layer and one whole idea. It's not that one guitar is playing a riff and guitar two is playing that riff transposed up a fifth. It's guitar one has its part and guitar two has a completely separate part, and they fit together to create this overall sound. And it just gives this album such a rich and such a thick sounding texture. Probably the best example of, there are tons and tons of harmonies all over this album, but I think the best example is right on the very first track. Right when you hit play, you are blessed with probably my most listened song of all time, In the Mist She Was Standing. The track starts off with just a couple hits, and then these guitars launch into the most beautiful, mesmerizing harmonies that, to me, I've never heard anything else like it. And the intro of that song is just an absolute beauty of guitar arrangement. Just the harmonies, the counter melodies, and everything that goes on, it's just unbelievable. I've never heard any band write harmonies even close to this. There's definitely a little bit of like a Iron Maiden influence in their harmonies, but they mix it with like a lot of atmosphere to create just really depressive and sad sounding riffs. I think Opeth is known for a lot of their mid-era and later albums where they were more of a commercial rock and metal act, but in these early days, this is just really depressive and sad music, but they're able to overlay it with this relaxing and just atmosphere of peace, especially with the acoustics. And that was really what Opeth went on to define themselves as in their career, with really good use of acoustics throughout their whole discography. But my favorite examples of that are on here. Michael Ackerfeld, really good clean singing on this album. A good example of what really highlights his voice is on the track "The Twilight Is My Robe." There's this nice section with a really pretty sounding acoustic guitar pattern, and he's doing his clean vocals, and then the song just perfectly transitions into this beautiful clean guitar solo. This album is a work of magic. My personal favorite songs on here are the opener, "In the Mist She Was Standing," "The Twilight Is My Robe," and the last song, "The Apostle in Triumph." Definitely super, super epic sounding track. Great way to close out the album. There's also a piano interlude called Requiem that was written by, not Requiem, Silhouette is the piano interlude. It was written by the drummer, Anders Norden. It's a really, really nice, haunting composition. And they also do have another acoustic interlude track, Requiem, that is done really, really well. And another thing I enjoy about this album is there's definitely the progressive elements of Opeth, very, very much evident in there, but it's not the emphasis as it would later become on albums like Blackwater Park. But there's some really cool use of, odd time signatures, and in the interlude track Requiem, they quote, they reference one of the earlier riffs in the later songs, which is really nice. Excellent songwriting, excellent atmosphere. The best riffs to have ever been recorded. I hope one day that this album gets topped by something I've listened to, but so far, nothing has able to conjure up a feeling of both sadness, amazement, and serenity that Opeth just capitalizes on this album. So I could go on about this album for a long time, and I highly, highly recommend checking this out if you haven't heard it. If you're more of a black metal fan and the later sound of Opeth kind of turns you off, don't let that fool you. Early Opeth is atmospheric death black metal, whatever you want to call it. It is truly a work of art. 10 out of 10 album, without a doubt. And the first of the trilogy from 1995, Opeth's Orchid. And only 1 year after that, they would go on to release their second album from 1996 called Morning Rise. Now, this album is pretty much on par with Orchid. I prefer Orchid just a little bit more, but this one is also nothing short of a masterpiece. Opeth really dives more into that depressive atmosphere and those depressive lyrics in this album. The harmonies are still there, but not quite to the same extent. But they take a little bit of a different approach, maybe a bit more clean guitar work, as opposed to some of the other stuff on Orchid. But yeah, this is basically just a continuation of Opeth's early sound. Some great tracks on here. The opener, Advent, The Night in the Silent Waters, that is definitely a good track. I think what this album does have over Orchid, though, is just that sense of sadness and despair. You can really tell Michael Ackerfeld put a lot into his lyrics on this record. I know the second track, The Night in the Silent Waters, is actually about the death of his grandfather, and you can really tell that those lyrics are very powerful to him, and he does a great job conveying that to paper and to the listener. Really every song on here is extremely well done. Two of my favorites off this album, I know I listed three, but I would say if I had to choose two, it would be Nectar and Black Rose Immortal, which is kind of one of the only songs. That and To Bid You Farewell are two of the only tracks that kind of survived with Opeth's legacy past the Candelight years, which is a shame. But at the same time, those are two excellent, excellent songs. Black Rose Immortal being a magnificent 20-minute long song, and it's an example of Opeth's talent in the songwriting department. It's 20 minutes, and it's not boring in the slightest. The song has really, really good build, and just overall, this is an amazing record. The lyrics are really good too. I think Opeth is a bit of a standout band in that sense too, because essentially these lyrics on the first 3 albums are pretty much just love songs, and not many underground and extreme black/death metal acts were doing that, and I think Opeth did that excellent. And my favorite thing about this album, though, would have to be the bass playing and the bass performance by Johan de Farfalla. He plays a fretless bass on here, and he just has the most excellent and the most well thought out and precise bass lines. There's some really funky parts too, where he's like playing slap bass, and it's like a 5-string, so when he pops that low B, it really comes through really, really nice, and it just adds another atmospheric layer that Opeth is able to capitalize on. He does a lot of cool tricks using the fretless bass, like some really nice slides with his fingers that just have this really pretty sound to it. And yeah, just like Orchid, this album has an amazing duality between depression, sadness, while also displaying peace and a sense of calm. And I have to acknowledge, I know there's a lot of glare, but that album cover is a great representation and a great fit for that album. So Opeth's second album, definitely another 10 out of 10. And 2 years later, the last record they would release on Candelight is 1998, My Arms, Your Hearse. And this is definitely an album where you can start to see Opeth transitioning into the later sound. And it's really a good way to end the trilogy, because it still has the same tropes and that classic Opeth atmosphere and that depressive elements that they brought with the first 2 albums. But here's where those progressive elements start to get a little bit more upfront and center. This is Opeth downsized to a 3-piece with Michael and Peter on guitar, and the drummer has been switched out for, what's this guy's name? Martin Lopez on drums. And Michael Ackerfeld also plays bass, and he does a surprisingly good job of holding down the bass lines. But I will say, I think the sound does suffer a little bit from losing Johan de Farfalla from the first 2 albums, because that was one of my favorite parts about Opeth's sound was the bass playing, especially the fretless bass playing on Morning Rise. But anyway, the bass playing is still very solid on here. It starts off with a really nice piano interlude, and then it goes straight into the track April Ethereal, which is another amazing, and maybe in my top 2, tied for In the Mist She Was Standing Opeth songs. It's definitely a really, really killer track, and it just encompasses everything Opeth strived to do on this album. There's clean singing, there's really good riffs, great atmosphere, and I will say the drum playing is super, super aggressive on here. Opeth is never a band that I would describe as heavy. I don't think they were ever trying to be heavy on the first 3 albums. But the drumming is very powerful, and it's very aggressive. There's a really angry sounding double bass, and I really like that about this record. Another great track is the second song titled Win. A really good extended clean vocal section, and this album has some really powerful sounding riffs, a little bit of a precursor to the sound that they would go on to do. Demon of the Fall is also another classic track that has survived past the early years and into Opeth's modern live set. And this is just, it's another excellent album. I will say it is a little, very, very slight bit of a downgrade from the first 2, just because a lot of the use of harmonies are replaced by more power chord riffing, which is still cool, but it is a little bit different, and I do find myself sometimes wishing that those majestic harmonies were on this record. But there's still some really powerful moments, and I do like how it's kind of one of those albums that stands out from the first 2. The ending track on here, Karma, the ending full-length track, there's a little outro titled Epilogue with some cool organ. But the last full song on here, Karma, is probably one of the most underappreciated songs in Opeth's discography to me. It's got this really cool section near the middle and end. It's just a really good chord progression, and it shows Michael Ackerfeld and I think Peter wrote some of the music on here. It shows how they had such a good command of chord progressions and harmonies, and how tension is going to resolve with certain chords. And yeah, this just solidifies that Opeth and the whole band is definitely a master. They're master songwriters, and they are really, really good performers. So this album closes out the Candelight years. My Arms, Your Hearse. I would give this a 9.5, so just a little bit less than the first two. But at the end of the day, these are all absolutely amazing albums. I cannot recommend these enough, especially if you have never heard of, or if you're not familiar with Opeth's early days, because I know a lot of people, at least in the extreme underground of black metal, might write off Opeth because of their later stuff, but their early albums fit right into that like classic Swedish black metal sound. I know most people call them death metal, but to me it feels a lot more like black metal with the atmosphere and all that stuff that they lay in with the depressive elements. I would just say check it out if you haven't heard it before, and if you have heard it, listen to it again, because those albums are all that good. So anyway, thank you guys for watching.